Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Okay, we continue in the book of Zechariah, and I want to again state to you that this is a somewhat difficult book to understand, particularly those first 7 and 8 chapters, but not impossible, as you've seen from the little that we've looked at, and particularly from what we're going to see this evening. Some of the symbolism that's used here is just a bit obscure to us at this time, but that doesn't mean that this isn't also breaking down as we go through the study. Some of this comes really in the form of fulfilled prophecies that are happening. So we're going to see these prophecies better and better as we move closer towards the end of the age or the end time. Last week we started in chapter 1 of Zechariah, and the first 6 verses really brought out the message to the Jewish people that God's covenant, his original thing that he said to them, agreement that he cut with them, what he pledged to Abram or Abraham, still stands. Still stands. At this time of its writing, it's about 519 BC. We have to understand that the position that the Jewish people are in is that the temple still hasn't been rebuilt. It's been nearly 70 years since it was destroyed. Jerusalem was also destroyed, pretty much flattened. And the entire population of Israel, or Judah at that point, both countries, but Israel about 100 years before Judah, that whole population was displaced. Many were killed in the process of this happening. So the first thing that God establishes with Zechariah, who begins his ministry upon his return. He was born in Persia or Babylon. He begins his ministry with the group that comes back to begin rebuilding of the temple and the repopulation. So, first thing that we have to see is that in this first vision, 4 horsemen are down in a ravine, if you remember that. Down in a myrtle thicket. Remember that the colors of the horses are given, and as far as I know, we don't yet have an understanding of what the significance of these horses' colors are, but we'll get something along as we approach the end of the age, because nothing is in Scripture just for filler to make a bigger, heavier book to carry around. These horsemen are God's reconnaissance of the whole earth, and this reconnaissance is being done in a quiet manner, and it's being done in such a quiet manner that man isn't really aware of it. Or maybe not so much that man isn't aware of it as man just isn't paying attention to anything that God is doing, but understand that God himself is tremendously interested in his creation and is constantly keeping track of his creation. By and large, man doesn't see this, down to the point where many choose to ignore that God would even be doing this. I'm going to get into an example of this in 2 Kings. Elisha the prophet would go to the king of Israel and tell the king of Israel what the Syrians, that would be Aram, the Arameans back in those days, and Israel would counterattack. So the king of Aram was saying, in essence, to his leadership, we've got a mole. We've got a mole. There's a spy in our ranks who's giving all of our secrets out to the king of Israel. So give me 2 Kings, please, chapter 6, verse 8. Now the king of Aram went to war against Israel, and in consulting with his servants, he said, I'll set up an ambush camp in such and such place. And the man of God, that would be Elisha, sent this message to the king of Israel, be careful not to go past such and such place, because Aram will attack there. So the king of Israel sent men to the place the God of man had told him about and warned him about, and he took special precautions there. This happened more than once or twice, and it greatly upset the king of Aram. He called his servants and said to them, tell me which one of you is betraying us to the king of Israel. And one of his servants replied, it's not that, my lord king. Rather, Elisha the prophet, who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words you speak privately in your own bedroom. Now, Elisha is not really even where the king is, much less being in his own bedroom, so where is he getting this information? Well, it's these horsemen, these spies that are roaming the world, listening in on everything that's going on, keeping God updated on what's going on. And so God has this information transferred to Elisha, his prophet, who relays it on to the king of Israel. And if we look at that last line up there, it really gives us an idea of what's going on. You know, the Elisha the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the words that you speak privately in your own room. He's not even in Aram. So that tells us really a lot about where this is going. And there's also, right here in this same chapter of 2 Kings, chapter 6, there's an idea given of the kind of information as God is gathering, and also whose army that we have, Israel has, to protect it from the king of Aram. So 2 Kings chapter 6, beginning in verse 13, please. He said, that's the king of Aram, go and see where he is so that I can send and bring him here. And they told him he's in Dothan. So he sent horses, chariots, and a large army there. They came by night and surrounded the city. And the servant of the man of God, servant of Elisha, got up early in the morning, and on going outside he saw an army with horses and chariots surrounding the city. His servant said to him, Elisha, oh, my master, this is terrible. What are we going to do? And Elisha answered, don't be afraid. Those who are with us outnumber those who are with them. And Elisha prayed to Adonai, I ask you to open his eyes so that he can see. And then Adonai opened the young man's eyes, and he saw there before him all around Elisha the mountain was covered with horses and fiery chariots. When they came down to him, Elisha prayed to Adonai, please strike these people blind, and he struck them blind as Elisha had asked. See, the army of God was in the mountains surrounding Elisha, even though this army had showed up to take him, and Elisha just simply make them blind, and they did, and Elisha and his servants simply walked away while they were under the additional protection of the warriors of God. Man doesn't see this either. Man doesn't see this either, and it's written out in plain language, no interpretation required. The information being passed on to the king of Israel by Elisha was collected by these emissaries, represented by the four angels, the four horsemen in the myrtle thicket, if you will. This has been going on constantly. This has been going on ever since God had man loosed on the earth and man left the garden and began to expand, even up to us in this present day. There's somebody representing these group of angels that are keeping track of everything here with us this evening, who will indeed relay this information on to those that are ruling us in the heavenlies. This angel in the myrtle thicket that was speaking to Zechariah goes on to tell him that the world is quiet and at peace. And we discussed this, I think, at some length, that perhaps a better translation would be that the world sits still and is at rest, because the connotation in the Hebrew that's given, this is not peace in a good sense, this is an imposed peace. It's something that's laid out there so that there's no choice but to keep quiet and be at peace with those that are going on. A harsh peace, if you will. I mentioned the Pax Romana that Rome imposed on its empire, and that same false peace is due to be shattered. That false peace is not going to happen. Egypt really kind of almost qualifies for this. There's a peace between Israel and Egypt. And Egypt's failure is going to be not honoring a treaty that is international in vogue. It's treaties with Israel, but the treaty is also so that they don't align themselves with any of the other nations that might come against Israel. I'll look quickly at that one, if you will. So let's go to Ezekiel 29, 6 and 7. Then all who live in Egypt will know that I am Adonai, because they, Egypt, have been a support of straw for the house of Israel. They're supposed to be, through this treaty that they've made with Israel, supporting Israel, making sure that everything between Israel and them stays kosher. And then it says in verse 7, when they grasp you, when Israel grasps Egypt in hand, Egypt will splinter and throw all their shoulders out of joint. When they leaned on you, you broke and made them wrench their backs. This is prophetic of things that are going to be happening in the future between Israel and Egypt. That's something that's actually going on today. And Israel and Egypt's peace treaty is still in effect. And Egypt is cooperating with Israel. Some of the cutback in the Gaza thing last week was worked out through Egypt and everything. But the problem is that Israel is depending on this peace treaty with Egypt to stay in place so it won't have to fight a two-front war. Fight a two-front war along with the Palestinian-Gaza war that's going on in their presence now, because things are building up to the north that could pop at just almost any time. And we know that this deals with sometimes in the future. We know that it may be the immediate future, but we don't know exactly when. We know that this is still in the future because historically a 40-year exile of Egypt that comes out of this prophetic event, because they do turn against Israel and they don't help Israel out when they're needed, so they end up being put out in total exile from everybody that they would normally deal with for 40 years by God. Remember, Zechariah is dealing with Israel, not world events. So what Zechariah 1:11 is speaking of, where we stopped last week, is really a peace, a false peace concerning Israel that's going to be shattered. This is speaking of a peace, but it's not the kind of peace that God wants. It's the kind of peace that man has manufactured. This information we took about Ezekiel 29, 6 and 7, about Egypt having a peace treaty with Israel. Study the 29th chapter of Ezekiel, verses 1 through 12, thoroughly on your own time as a homework detail, because it'll really give you some good information on what is going on today concerning the relationship between Egypt and Israel. All right, we're going to get started now into Zechariah, still in chapter 1, verses 1, 12 through 13. The angel of Adonai said, Adonai Tzavot, how long will you keep withholding mercy from Jerusalem and the cities of Judah? You've been angry with them for the past 70 years. Take note of that 70 years that he's been angry with in that, because this is prophetic that he's going to have been angry with them for 70 years. Adonai replied with the kind and comforting words to the angel who was speaking with me. We're going on with Vision 1 here. It's a continuation of Vision 1. The angel asked God, "How long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and the cities of Judah? You've been angry with them for 70 years. And God's response is immediate and comforting, but we're not given any answer of how long this will go on. Only we're told that he's been angry with him for 70 years. Neither are we told the time that God is going to remain angry with Israel in this present time, this time that we're in right now, with Israel being the only thing we're given is this hint of 70 years. Historically, we know that God began to work with Israel as a nation again around 1890, the beginning of the Zionist movement. Note that the angel's question to God is not directed so much as being to the people, but as to the political entity of Jerusalem and Judah. And the angel spoke of 70 years of God's anger, and this has to do with the prophecy in Jeremiah 25:11 and 12, please. This entire land will become a ruin, a waste, and these nations will serve the king of Babel for 70 years. But when the 70 years are over, I will punish the king of Babel and that nation, Babylon, for their sins, says Adonai, and I will turn the land of the Kasdim into everlasting ruins. The prophecy in Jeremiah again is for 70 years. The 70 years are about overlord. How much longer are you going to remain angry is what we want to take out of this. In Zechariah chapter 1, again, verses 14 and 15, please. The angel speaking with me then said to me, "Here's what Adonai Sabaoth says, I am extremely jealous on behalf of Jerusalem and Zion, and to the same degree extremely angry with the nations who are so self-satisfied, because I was only a little angry at Jerusalem and Zion, but they have made the suffering worse." What we looked at in our first look in 11 and 12 of Zechariah chapter 1 speaks, I believe, to today. We went back to Jeremiah 25 and looked at the same sort of thing prophetically, but it was speaking of the time when we were doing the Babylonian Empire. So that's a type and foreshadow, if you will, that's being kicked forward, that there's going to be 70 years of time where God is going to end up being angry. And it's not only just with Israel, but it's also with the nations that are around them. So here in verses 14 and 15, he's saying, I was only a little angry at Jerusalem and Zion, but he's now angry at the nations as well because they've made the suffering worse. See, the angel here, as we begin, the angel was speaking to Zechariah, and he said to him, here's what's going on. See, the angel was told to proclaim God's words, to interpret them to Zechariah, and the words again tell us that God is in control and active in the world, and I'm jealous on behalf of Jerusalem and Zion, and I'm extremely angry at the nations that are so self-satisfied. This revealing a very intense relationship about Israel that he has, but also that the nations surrounding them have. And Islam claims this business of the relationship with Jerusalem and the nations around them to be part of their scripture as well. And I think they should think about this. Now, God feels strongly and reacts vigorously to the way his people behave. Modern Body of Messiah claims this, part of their scripture. And I think they should also think about this. Because here are two things that are mentioned that are carried out in the scriptures that are not really being paid attention to by the people that are today currently occupying the world and the area around Jerusalem and Judah, at what God is actually doing. Particularly since this thing that's going on with Judah and Jerusalem has been going on for 70 years. Because when Judah became a state again, when Israel was reestablished in 1947, 48, and declared itself in 48, they attacked and began 70 years. And the attack was not only by those of Islam, but the attack against Israel got almost no support, at least initially, by those claiming to be following the God of Israel in the form of the church. God also reacts vigorously against Israel, Jerusalem, and Zion. This phrase, Jerusalem and Zion, not only refers to the city and the temple, but to the political religious center of the nation. Verse 15 shows a great difference in God's attitude towards Jerusalem and his attitude towards the nations around them. God's attitude towards his people, as seen in verse 12, indicates that he's mad because of disobedience. But this ire, being mad, is a temporary and is subject to his compassion. The nations surrounding them, however, are also a focus of his anger, not because of broken a covenant with him, like of the one with Israel, but because they're so self-satisfied. Because they're so thinking of themselves that they have a false, arrogant, prideful assumption about themselves and their abilities and what they can carry on and what they can do, not including himself. This anger is increased when they, the nations, made Israel's suffering worse. First 70 years of Israel's current existence, the nations did almost nothing to support them. In fact, the nations created situations whereby it made it more and more difficult for Israel to do anything. The Stockholm Conference, for instance, gave the nations added push to keep working to divide the nation until there is actually established two separate nations in place, a Palestinian nation and the nation of Israel. And God's going to be a little more than bent out of shape about that, according to what we're translating out of this Zechariah 1:14 and 15. The inference is that the nations plot and sow evil. Well, they've plotted. We're going to create two nations in there, one of Islam and one of Israel, and then we'll have peace in the world. And of course, when they say peace, peace, there will be no peace. If we look at today's attitude by the nations that surround Israel, the close nations, they think that they're secure because of their own abilities. We can go in and do these things because of our own abilities. We can do this, and this is what they're sowing and plotting, which is evil. Zechariah 1:16, please. Therefore Adonai says, I will return to Jerusalem with merciful deeds. My house will be built there, says Adonai Tzavot. Yes, a measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem. Take note of that term, measuring line. We're going to deal with that in a little bit. God's anger, God's ire, turns to compassion for Israel. For Israel. The temple would be completed about 4 years from this time of Zechariah's writing this. And it's a type and foreshadow that God is going to have a temple rebuilt. But the city walls would not be completed for a substantial period of time, and the measuring line refers to the rebuilding of the city both then and in modern times. Okay? Modern times is fascinating. Verse 17. In addition, proclaim that Adonai Tzavot says, my cities will again overflow with prosperity. Adonai will again comfort Zion, and he will make Jerusalem the city of his choice. There's nothing in this that's being said at all about anything to do with Islam having anything to do with Israel and Judah. It's all for Adonai. There's a threefold prophecy here about prosperity. 1, comfort. 2, and choice. Choice. In the language used here, prosperity is kind of like a spring that gushes out and sends water in all directions. That's going to be what happens when Messiah, God, returns to Jerusalem and he begins to spread himself out over the whole world. And Jerusalem will be kind of like that spring of water which will overflow and bring prosperity, all those around it. Because Jerusalem, all of those around it will prosper. It's talking about the people now. It's not talking about Islam. It's talking about the people. God will again comfort Zion. God will again choose Jerusalem. And this is reflecting divine approval for both the rebuilding of the temple and the city of Jerusalem, and really is a sanctification of the city as a whole. And this also, as we push forward, speaks to the end times and into the millennium, because God will choose Jerusalem. And Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48 speak of a temple being built during the millennial period. And we need to remember that prior to the temple being destroyed the first time, the glory of God left this temple. Ezekiel talks about this. We need to think about this. The glory of God has never returned to the temple since he left prior to the destruction of the first temple. Even to Herod's temple during the time of Messiah, Messiah only came up into the court of the men. He didn't ever enter the temple. But in Ezekiel 43, verses 1 through 5, we find something interesting. After this, Elijah talking, I believe, he brought me to the gate facing east, where I saw the glory of the God of Israel approaching from the east. His voice was like the sound of rushing water, and the earth shone with his glory. The visions seemed like the vision I had seen when I came to destroy the city. Also the visions were like the vision I had seen by the Kavar River, and I fell on my face. Adonai's glory entered the house through the gate facing east. Next, the Spirit took me up and brought me into the inner courtyard, and I saw God's glory fill the house. God's glory is seen re-entering the temple that will be in place at the end of the age. That's what Ezekiel saw. It's very likely that what this is talking about is what was back in Zechariah chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, particularly where it says he will return to Jerusalem. He will comfort Zion and make Jerusalem the city of his choice. Now, we're going to begin to get into Zechariah chapter 2. However, if you're looking at a Christian Bible, you're going to find that you're still in chapter 1 with a different verse. What I'm going to project up here for you eventually is going to, I believe, begin to show you the second verses. Go to Zechariah chapter 2, 1 and 2, please. Then I looked up and saw 4 horns, and I asked the angel who was speaking to me, "Who are these?" And he answered, "These are the horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem." Subtitle for this second vision might be "The Nations Met Retribution." The statement, "Then I looked up," indicates that Zechariah saw something visually. Something caught his attention. He's still outside the city. He's still probably where he saw the horsemen. And something caught his attention. It's not that he looked up into the sky. Suddenly, right there in front of him was something brand new presented, and what he sees is 4 horns. Now, to understand what's going on here, when the term horn is used in conjunction with the number 4, it generally speaks to something of invincible strength. So he saw 4 horns. He saw something of incredible strength and power shown to him in front of him. Now, this is one of those places where there's several schools of thought. Some think that all of the military might in the world is represented here. The totality of opposition to God is mentioned here in these 4 horns. The military dimension of this symbol of power is paramount here. And this is looking at God. This is looking at something of that's coming against God. And there's some consensus among those who study things that these really represent the 4 major empires of man that have existed until the time of his writing. These 4 horns. That would be Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. I'm not sure that that combination merits, as there are 4 horns here, and those would only be 3. Daniel, however, does speak to 4 horns, 4 empires, while Jerusalem is trodden down by the Gentiles. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and the 4th empire that begins with Rome and extends into the end times. So I think this is quite possibly what this prophecy speaks to. He is shown 4 horns, horns in the number 4, talking of invincible strength. This is something that's coming at the people of God from the adversary, probably scattered all the way across from Babylon into the end of the age and beyond. I think this prophecy extends to the end times. The Jewish Stone edition Tanakh that we've referred to a couple of times is interesting here. It takes the position that these 4 horns are 4 kingdoms of Daniel 2. The 4 kingdoms of Daniel 2, where the statue stood representing all 4 kingdoms, and the stone carved out not by human hands destroyed them all at once. Commentary in the Stone edition names these 4 places that they think are represented: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And they think all of them extend until the end, at least in partial, in some form. All of them exist right up to the final redemption. Guess who? By Messiah. Now, in their case, it's the first time he shows up, but we know a little different. The stone is cut out, which strikes the feet of the statue representing the final kingdom. Then all the kingdoms collapse together as the entire statue falls, and they're blown away like chaff on a threshing floor. And Zechariah asks for an interpretation, and the answer that he gets is even difficult to grasp. The word scatter here comes from an agricultural term in the Hebrew meaning to winnow. In other words, toss what you've harvested up in the air, and the heavy grain will fall out, and the chaff will blow away. To separate the wheat from the chaff. And the instruments of the scattering, the winnowing of the chaff, making some of it go away that they don't want to have anymore, are the horns. The horns are the instruments of the scattering. Now, the listing of Judah and Jerusalem is unexpected in that they are listed along with Israel in this. The horns scattered were Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Israel is mentioned in here, so it actually is going back to prior to what we're looking at with Judah being taken out. The northern kingdom, which was the first to be deported or scattered, is also here listed here. So this is going back to before the statue of Daniel in chapter 2. Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom in 721 before the Common Era. So the listing of Judah and Jerusalem along with Israel seems to indicate that this is talking about the scattering of all of the chosen people. It's talking about all of the 12 tribes were scattered by those who are represented in these 4 horns that Zechariah is being shown here. All of them were scattered throughout the world. We know that to be a fact now because all are being regathered from the world. So, with the whole pagan world given as being responsible for the scattering, that the four horns represent the pagan world in general, being responsible for the scattering of the chosen people throughout the world, I think this works because all of the pagan world being held responsible would be because they belong to Hasatan. Now, Zechariah chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Next Adonai showed me 4 artisans. I asked, what are these coming to do? And he said, these horns that scattered Judah so completely that no one could even raise his head, well, these men, meaning the artisans, have come to terrify them, meaning the horns, to overthrow the nations that raised their horns against the land of Judah, to scatter it. Suddenly a second set of characters appear. In the second vision are 2 distinct images. This vision stands alone in this, with the 2 distinct images. In place are the horns. They've already been presented to Zechariah in what he's being shown. And now these artisans are craftsmen or carpenters, very often used in different translations. These horns and artisans come together, and prophetically they're ultimately going to face off against each other. And I want to point out that very interestingly, it is God himself that introduces the second set called the artisans. Zechariah looked up and there were the 4 horns. Bang, they were there. He just looked up, all of a sudden there they were in front of him. But then Adonai brings into place in front of him the 4 artisans. And the word here, showed me, emphasizes God's role in this part of the vision. This divine direct appearance has 2 effects. It emphasizes divine action being taken in this. The artisans are an exercise in divine action being taken. And 2, it indicates in a general way the interaction of God and the angelic figures, the mediators of divine will that are in place. All of this is working together as a plan that God has worked out. The word artisan here oftentimes refers in the Hebrew to smiths or metal workers, such as blacksmiths, but could be stone workers or carpenters. And the latter, of course, is interesting, as Yeshua identifies himself as a carpenter. These were the technology of the day, metal workers and stone workers and carpenters and so forth. And they are being represented to us as the agents of disassembly for God to take apart what the horns are creating. The artisans represent the skilled workers of the day, whenever that day might occur, all the way up through and to including when Yeshua returns. These skilled workers will be able to take apart what the horns are creating. I think that the meaning of these symbolic figures may be explained to some extent by noting these 3 features. Number 1, the use of the word number 4 again here is implying a totality. These artisans are of every bit of the same kind of strength and totality that the horns. The artisans are introduced, number 2, by God himself. And 3, the immediate reaction of Zechariah is not to ask about the identity of these figures, the artisans, but rather about their purpose. About their purpose. He's looking directly into that. Now, these features together link the totality of the activities of God to the artisans that these divine agents, these are divine agents that will be carrying out God's will. They would represent a specified future action against a world power, which would be the horns that scattered Judah, not just from the land, but further abroad. The artisans are pictures of agents of divine will against the horn, these horns who scattered Judah so that no one could raise his head, we're told. The horns will have such effect that there will be no personal independence or autonomy for those that were scattered. And that's basically what happened if we look back at the last 2,000 years before Israel was reformed. Look what they've been through for that 2,000 years. There was no personal independence. There was no autonomy. They were the dregs of the world, considered by most of the world that they were sent into. This is also talking about, I believe, the number 666. Because if we think about Revelation 13, figure out what kind of personal independence or autonomy the people are going to have at that time, considering that they won't even be able to work or buy food or do anything if they don't have that number. It's going to be much the same thing as that Israel was going through over the last 2,000 years, and in some cases beyond that. And of course, the answer is that those in the final time, if they don't have the seal of God on their foreheads or carry that number, they're going to have to deal with starvation. And of course, those that have the seal of Adonai will not. We can see how these things are really interwoven with the future. Now, the artisans have come, or will come, to terrify the horns, to overthrow them. So what does this actually refer to? The Hebrew structure, I want to add this now so that we can pick up on it. The Hebrew structure of these passages adds emphasis to what's happening here. The word meaning to terrify or to overthrow the horns is in the masculine plural in the Hebrew. We're seeing a source identity. They are of the masculine plural. However, the horns that are to be overthrown are in the feminine plural in this passage, identified in a different gender, indicating they are not from the same source as the ones that are coming after them. We can take the horn's source to be from Satan. They're not from God. The ones that are going to overthrow them are from God. So what's the other active ingredient in this? The horns would be from Satan. And that is built into the Hebrew construct of this passage that this information is given to Zechariah for additional emphasis. I'm going to run through that again real quickly. The Hebrew structure adds emphasis to what is happening here. The word meaning to terrify or overthrow the horns is in the masculine plural. We're seeing a source identity of them being the ones with the terrifying ability. Their source would be Adonai. However, the horns to be overthrown are in the feminine plural, identified in a different gender, indicating they're not from the same source as the ones that are coming after them. So we can take the horns source to be from Satan. And this is again built into the Hebrew construct for emphasis here. The masculine and the feminine delineating something special to us. These artisans sent by Adonai will overthrow the nations who have raised their horns against the land of Judah to scatter it. That's the purpose of what's coming against Israel right now, to scatter it. And these that are coming against the horns are going to come against the horns of the nations that have raised their horns against Judah to scatter it. It's interesting that the Stone Edition Tanakh here calls the four artisans four carpenters. And in the text note states that these carpenters are successive conquerors of the four kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, that have raised up their horns against Israel. And that the fourth and final carpenter will be the King Messiah himself. That's in the Stone Edition Tanakh. I found that interesting in light of a carpenter being a builder of Israel, and Yeshua establishing himself as the carpenter. The artisans overthrow these horns of the nations. Literally, this speaks of ending the activities of these pagan-driven nations. These horns represent military power and might be of pagan nations. When the number 4 is used, it represents a totality of military power. That also, I believe, has representation. So the term nations now is in the plural, and this is maybe a confederation of nations, or maybe even an empire. Consolidation of this military power and might. We saw this consolidation of military power and might in the Gulf War in 1990. The longer-term entity that's in place right now of military power and might would be NATO, and a more iron-fisted version of this would have been the Soviet Union. That's the kind of thought that's here. In verse 4 it says, "These nations have lifted up their horn, their power against Judah." Now, even though our text says horns, the original Hebrew is in the singular. This is the fourth use of the term. In some texts, the fifth use. This is the only use in the singular. And the rest are in the plural, and the singular use here could mean military consolidation at the end of the age. Again, it could mean a coalition of nations, or maybe it's talking about a one-world power, a one-world government. These coalitions and consolidations seem to be working their way towards that, getting us used to that kind of a concept. The word scatter is used here a third time, each time still containing the connotation of chaff from grain. Later on in Zechariah, we're going to see that 1/3 of Israel accepts Messiah as part of this winnowing process, being brought to finality with the intervention of the carpenters. They will be what is left after the chaff is all blown away. Well, that ends the second vision. The third vision that we look at in Zechariah could have as a subtitle, Jerusalem has divine protection. Jerusalem has divine protection. Zechariah 2, 5, and 6, please. "I looked up and saw a man with a measuring line in his hand, and I asked, 'Where are you going?' And he said to me, 'To measure Jerusalem, to determine its width and its length.'" Here, looked up again, applies to another vision watching or catching Zechariah's attention. By the way, I think it's believed that all these visions occurred on the same site. Now, this vision specifically concerns Jerusalem and not the nations. Zechariah is still apparently outside the city, as he was in the first vision, and he sees a man with a measuring line in his hand. This is not like that measuring line we looked at in chapter 1:16. It's not even used as the same Hebrew words. This is a cord or a string as expressed in two Hebrew words used together to describe a measuring device. The first Hebrew word that provides meaning to the imagery is the word havel, Havel, which is a cord or a string used for measurement. And the second word is midah, which means measurement or of measurement. And it's believed that the midah could have a range of meanings to include, even when combined with havel, a cord of inheritance. It's talking about a cord of inheritance. They're going to lay something out that's going to be an inheritance. Inheritance referring to the land God has allotted to Israel, with Jerusalem as its center, and the cord for measuring that inheritance, which will be laying out a future Jerusalem. Zechariah asks the man, obviously another angel, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" And we need to pay attention, because neither the man nor the measuring cord is what constitutes the image here of this vision. The act of measuring does not fully convey to us the full range of the man's activities. The word where in "where are you going" directs attention to the object of the man's measuring. What is the object of the man's measuring? And the word going directs attention to the place where the man is going to actually perform the act. So, where are you going to do this? What is it going to be the place? And the man in the vision answered, beginning with the words, "To measure Jerusalem." I'm going to measure Jerusalem. The thought here is to establish an area that will be eventually filled out as established by these dimensions that he's going to lay out. The man is going to measure Jerusalem, but the thought here is not of the existing Jerusalem that's in place at that time, but the Jerusalem that will eventually be filled out to these measured dimensions. The expression, its length and width, speaks of a measured area. This is not directly connected to the restoration of the temple, only to the coming of Jerusalem to size. The boundaries of Jerusalem are really more directly related to the royal estate of the house of David. Here the total area, though, is in view, not just the length and the distance around its walls. What involved here is a future Jerusalem with its adjacent lands. In Ezekiel's temple version, a rod was used for measurement, and in that prophecy, various measurements were given for an ideal future territory, and that vision of Ezekiel speaks to the millennium, in a time period after Yeshua's return and his reign begins on earth. Now, Zechariah chapter 2 continues on with this, 7 and 4. "Here the angel who was speaking to me went forward, and another angel went out and met him and said to him, 'Run and tell this young man, Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls.'" Take note of that. Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls, because there will be so many people and animals. "For," says Adonai, "I will be for her a wall of fire surrounding her, and I will be the glory within her." Another angel is introduced. In addition to the interpreting angel, maybe having more authority, we've got three individuals interacting with Zechariah at this point, visible to him. So we've got an idea of motion. Things are going on. Things are happening. This is pointing forward with the same idea of motion. The idea of running is introduced here. Things are going on, pointing to things that are going to happen. At this point, scholars disagree as to who the young man is. Some think it's Zechariah. Some think it's the young man that's talking to the angel. I'm going to go with Zechariah. The angels are given these instructions to either the man with the measuring line, probably another angel, or to Zechariah, because he's being prepped to give a prophecy which he is laying out. He is told that Jerusalem will be a city without walls. Now we have to remember in that particular time in history, for a lot of years after that, walls were cities' main protections. So this is prophetic that Jerusalem's going to be a city without walls. It wasn't until after the days of gunpowder, which is very recent in our time, to our times, that cities were beginning to be built without walls. See, cannons made walls around cities obsolete. This Jerusalem as a city without walls obviously speaks to a future time, to a Zion of the end times, a time which the normal existence of walls and the kind of strife walls implies is gone. Verse 9 says that God himself will be the wall of fire around Jerusalem, pointing to the returned Messiah, Yeshua. The idea of an unwalled city seems to speak of peace. It does, though, speak to a large population. It speaks to a time of prosperity because it speaks of a time when a great number of men and livestock are in it. Remember, livestock was the industry of the time of Zechariah, and a great amount of livestock means a lot of industry, a lot of prosperity. But unwalled cities does not speak to a time when defenses are not necessary. Look at Jerusalem today. Defenses are absolutely necessary for Jerusalem, even though it is an immense unwalled city in place at this time. And then there's the coming time of the millennial. For details on the millennial, we really have to go into Isaiah and the Tanakh if we want to know anything about that. Things like, if a man dies at 100, it'll be young, and it'll be because of sin during the millennium. Remember that at the end of the millennial time, Satan's going to be released again and raise an army that will come against Israel again. So even though unwalled Jerusalem is a time of prosperity such as it is now, it is not a time when defenses are not necessary. An unwalled cities speak of a time where the concept of war is different, probably because of weaponry, because verse 9 states that Messiah himself will be a wall around Jerusalem. Jerusalem has divine protection. Jerusalem will have, and still has, I believe right now at this moment, divine protection. Speaks of God's sovereignty in the sense that he will be there. Here God himself will be the guarantor of Jerusalem's safety. Her actual fortifications, the old wall around the old city, totally meaningless. These Zechariah visions can be a little bit obscure. So we're going to begin to wade back through them again as we get further in the series so that they'll be more apparent. I just want to make you aware of them. This presence of God means the time of the millennial when Yeshua is in Jerusalem with the saints. And I think it is possibly more. We'll get to that in Zechariah 14. This completes the third vision, and verse 10 starts with the expansion of the themes of the first three visions. So Zechariah 2, 10 and 11, please. Up, says Adonai, move, flee the land of the north, for I scatter you like the four winds of the sky, says Adonai. Move, Zion, you who are living with the daughter of Babylon, escape. Escape. I want to look at this word up that begins this. Some translations will say come, others say woe, some say alas. This word that's used here, up, can indicate a lament, a statement of doom, or an exhortation, or a warning. And at the same time, it is used to call to the people to bring them to attention, to pay attention what's going on. Bring them to attention with the nuance of sympathy and pity. It's urging them here to flee from an invasion coming from the land of the north. Consider this. The land of the north is used to indicate the direction from which the invaders who attacked Israel will come from if they're using only ground forces. If one comes to attack by ground from Babylonia or Persia, today's Iran, one first went up the Euphrates River westwardly, then turned south across western Syria to attack Israel. So the attack came from the north, no matter the original location of the attacker. No one came across from the east across the desert back in those days that Zechariah was writing this down. The point of turning would be near the intersection of the borders of modern Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. This would also be construed as actual areas to the north that are unnamed, but Babylon is mentioned specifically. See, too many people try to extend this, and the attack's going to come from Russia, the attack's going to come from hither, thither, and yon in theology. Babylon to the east can actually be seen as a land from the north, which is the direction the attack is going to come from. Now, the scattering caused by the action of the people from the north was a direct action of God. His hand was in it. He allowed it. There's two things going on here. First of all, the people that have come from the land of the north are going to be scattered. That ultimately led to the people being scattered to the four winds. People of Israel more recently have been pulled out of places in Iraq and Iran and sent to other countries. In some cases, they've worked their way into Israel. Now God is saying, flee that scattering. This is a plea to return to Him from that scattering caused by people who attack from the north. People attacking from the north has been a constant thing with Israel. This would include Assyria as well as Babylon, because Assyria took out the northern kingdom. This would include Rome, whose legions would have come around the Mediterranean, marched down from the north, even though they were to the west. Desert barrier to the east, sea barrier to the west, meant all of these attacks that scattered Israel would come from the north. And that is what is put forward, even though today we can fire rockets and fly airplanes and sail ships in any direction. But it's talking about these same countries, if I think I can make that point. When we get to the Olivet Discourse, Yeshua is going to say that the elect are going to return from the four winds. See, the dispersion of Israel to the four winds speaks of them being dispersed in every direction and everywhere. In verse 11, it says, for Israel to escape from Babylon, in effect from the places that they have been scattered to. We're going to find as we pursue this that Babylon is very often used not just as the nation Babylon that existed that took Judah out the first time, but any place that holds Israel captive is being referred to as Babylon or Bavel. And that those of Israel that remain in these nations are going to share the judgment fate of those nations when Adonai comes against them. So what's being asked now through the prophet is for those that have been placed in these nations, get out of there so they don't have to share that judgment fate. And now I don't know that this speaks to just those that are physically being there, or those that have assimilated themselves into those nations. We have people that have assimilated themselves into North America by changing their names and by refusing to make aliyah and all kinds of reasons. I think that's more than just a mere presence. Those that have chosen to turn from Israel and assimilated won't get the protection of God that those remain faithful to Him will have. God is seeking to draw His people back to Him, both physically and spiritually. And those that assimilate into the nations will be judged with the nations if they stay there. I'm going to wrap this up now and give you a week to try and assimilate everything that we've been given. And we'll do some review to help create some focus before we move on from this.